Okay, Tov. Today's daf is daf Lamed Zayin, and we'll start on the third line down from the top where we ended yesterday. V'chein b'yezer omer. Let's just review that there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. According to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, only the Daled Minim are kosher for schach, whereas according to the Chachamim, all of the minim, anything that grows from the ground, is kosher for schach. And the Chazal want to bring a raya from Tanakh, in this case from Sefer Nehemiah, that the Chachamim are correct. You can use anything that grows from the ground for schach. You're not limited to the Daled Minim. Ein bi Ezra Omer. Actually, it's in Sefer Nehemiah, but sometimes the Gemara calls Ezra Nehemiah. Tzeu hahar. And now we're talking about a command to the people of Israel that they should go to the mountain. V'aviu alei zayis, and alei zayis are not one of the four minim. V'alei eitz shemen, also eitz shemen is not one of the daled minim. These are what we call in English pine needles. Alei adas, alei tmarim, alei eitz avos. Those last three are coming from adasim, or the leaves of a palm tree, or of hadas. And in those cases, enochinami, those are shaykh to the daled minim, but he also includes here alei zayis and alei eitz shemet. And the end of the pasuk says lasot sukkos, to create tzchach for a sukkah. And it seems from this pasuk, that you can use the branches of other trees other than the daled minim for tzchach. And the Gemara now defends Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda savar, we should read the pasuk and split it into two. The first two cases here, we have alei zayis and alei eitz shemen. That's hani lutfanos. That's not for the schach, but rather for the dolphin. And the dolphin could be from anything. And then the rest of the pasuk, alei hadas, alei tmorim, alei eitz avos, that's l'schach. So we see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we can reinterpret this pasuk, and we can say that the schach has to be made from one of the four meanings. Utanan. Now Rava, which we saw yesterday on Daf Lamed Vav, said that you can take anything from the palm tree, even from the trunk of the tree. And that means that Rabbi Yehuda would accept anything from the species of the daled minim, including from the trunk of the tree. And the Gemara now wants to quote an earlier Mishnah in Masechet Succah that we learned at Daf Yud Dalet, and try to prove from that Mishnah that Rava is correct. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you can take from the trunk of the tree and make that wood into a plank and use that plank as schach, because that tree is a palm tree, and a lulav grows from that tree. So the entire tree, any part of it, is considered midalid haminim. And the Mishnah says the following: Mesachachin b'nisarim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. What that means is that Rabbi Yehuda maintains that you can take planks of wood and use it as schach. Why would we think otherwise? Because Rabbi Meir disagrees. He invalidates nisarim, planks, because of gzeras tikra, because they may confuse it with the roof of a house and come to the conclusion that you don't have to build a sukkah. You can just eat in your house as long as you have a roof made of planks. Rabbi Yehuda never accepted that gzera, and therefore he validated planks made out of wood as schach. And here we're going to have a machlokas, Rav and Shmuel, as to whether or not Rabbi Yehuda, in certain cases, let's say in a case where you had a plank that's very wide, it's 4 tvachim wide, he would concede to Rabbi Meir that should be prohibited and invalidated as schach because of the Gzeras Nesarim. And we have a more extreme shita and presentation of Rabbi Yehuda. And according to that shita, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if you had tfachim, 4 tfachim of Nesarim, even so, it's kosher. So that's going to be a machlokas Rav and Shmuel back on Daf Yudalid. Just to review, Rav has an all-encompassing, extreme presentation of Rabbi Yehuda Shita, all Nesarim, even if they're wider than 4 tfachim are kosher. V'schach, Rabbi Yehuda never accepted the Gzeras Nesarim and the Gzeras Tikra, whereas Shmuel has a more narrow machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, according to which Rabbi Yehuda concedes to Rabbi Meir there is an entity of Gzeras Nesarim, Gzeras Nesarim meaning to passel Nesarim Mishum Tikra, but that only applies if the Neser is 4 tfachim wide. So the machlokas, according to Shmuel, between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham is narrowed down to the case of a Neser that's less than 4 tfachim wide. In any event, when we talk about Nesarim, how do you get Nesarim? You can't take a lulav and end up with a plank of wood. So Rava says we have no choice but to understand that the Nesarim, which Rabbi Yehuda validates as schach, must be coming from the trunk of the tree or from the bark of the tree, namely a palm tree. Alma siv ve'ikara didikla. Ikara didikla is the trunk of the tree. The siv is that ivy kind of piece of twig that goes around and around. Bina de lulavu. It's considered the min of lulav, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it qualifies as schach. And the Gemara ends up with Shma Mina. This is a valid proof. So it means that Rabbi Yehuda considers that the trunks of the tree or the ivy that surrounds the tree, since they are part of the palm tree from which the lulav grows, that's considered min, and it's kosher for schach. So the Gemara now asks the following question: Umi Omer Rabbi Yehuda arbas minim in midi achrini lo? Is it really true, this record that we have, that according to the transmission, Rabbi Yehuda will disqualify anything other than the 4 minim eschach? For Asanya, what are we going to do with the following brisa? Sichacha b'nesarim shel erez. Erez is a different kind of a tree, presumably a cedar tree. But whatever tree it is, it's certainly not a palm tree, and therefore could not, according to our understanding, Rabbi Yehuda, qualify for schach. And yet, the Brisa records that Sichacha b'nesarim, if he used cedar trees as nesarim, nesarim means planks for his schach, sheyesh be'em asarat arba'at tfachim. This is a reflection of Shmuel's understanding of Rabbi Yehuda, that we said before that even Rabbi Yehuda accepts the Gzeras Tikra and he disqualifies Nesarim Eschach, but only if they have a width of 4 tfachim, is Divrei HaKol Psula. So in this case, the Nesarim are 4 tfachim wide, and therefore even Rabbi Yehuda would passel the Nesarim Mishum Gzeras Tikra, and that's the tradition of Shmuel. This brisa reflects the sheet of Shmuel. Ein bohem arba'at tfachim. If the neser is less than 4 tfachim wide, now, according to Shmuel, we have a machlokus between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir posed Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Umoda Rabbi Meir shem yesh pei neser leneser kim lo neser shem miniach psal beineim kshera. If you leave a space between one board, one plank, and another that's equal to the width of the plank, and you fill it in with schach kosher, which is called pesel, then the sukkah is kshera. Why? Because we can completely ignore the planks of wood and we can create a kosher schach from the schach that he puts as pesel in the openings and the airspace between one plank and the other. And this, if you recall, touches on a sugya, meruba kiparutz, or parutz kimeruba, meaning if you have a sukkah which is half covered by schach and half is invalid schach, can we kasher the sukkah? And this brisa maintains that the sukkah, according to everyone, even according to Rabbi Meir, is kasher. But in any event, what we have to know from this brisa is only one word, and that's eretz. Our good friend eretz, that an eretz can be used as schach. And we see, therefore, that Rabbi Yehuda, not the way we had the transmission, Rabbi Yehuda, is machshir even other minim that could not produce a lulav as schach. The Gemara says, you know what? We're going to invoke the shita of Rav Huna about what the word erez means. My erez, and this is going to be, excuse me, a biblical study of the etymology of a word based on Yeshayahu, and the Gemara is going to assume that the Mishnah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, will follow the pattern of Torah Shebechsav in the use of the word erez, not the way we use the word erez, but the way the Tanakh uses the word erez, specifically a pasuk in Yeshayahu. In the Rabbah bar Rav Huna, the Omer Rabbah bar Rav Huna, Amri Bey Rav, we learned in the yeshiva of Rav, Asara mine arazim. There are no less than 10 species that are all included in the generic term erez. 10 different species. 7 of the 10 are written in one particular passage, a verse in Sefer Yeshayahu, in Perek Mem Aleph, and Shenemar etain bamidbar erez, I will place in the desert erez, and then the pasuk tells you what is erez. And on the list of erez, again, there's 10 subcategories of erez. The one that interests us the most is a hadas. Hadas is called an erez. And therefore, when the brisa formulates a neser that's made of erez, it's not referring to a cedar tree, but rather the erez is referring to a hadas tree. Hence, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's kosher for schach. Now we go back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah records Rabbi Meir's shita that as far as eged is concerned, you can use any sort of a cord, a mashicha's a cord or rope, no matter what material it's made of, to bind 3 out of the 4 minim. Tanya, and we have a brisa in which Rabbi Yehuda is quoted as proving his shita by mentioning the minhag of Anshe Yerushalayim. Rabbi Meir Ma'aseh v'Yekirei Yerushalayim shayu ogdin es luluveim b'gimoniot shel zahav, that they tied the daled minim together with a cord that was made of gold fiber, and that's called gimoniot shel zahav. And that disproves the shita that requires mimin halulav as a binding cord around the daled minim. We see that even gold can be used to bind the daled minim. Amrullah b'cham raya, you bring a proof from the Yekirei Yerushalayim. B'mino hayu ogdino somi lamata. They would bind it with a branch of a lulav or a leaf of a lulav tree. And then on top of that, in order to beautify the daled minim, they put a gold wrapping around it. So don't always judge things by the wrapping, because you don't know what's underneath the wrapping. And in this case, underneath the wrapping was a piece of a lulav. Amalahu Rabba Lahanu Megadle Hoshana. Megadle means those who bind the Hoshana. They take the lulav and the Adasim and the Aravas, and they bind them together. And Rabbah instructed them, the Bereish Galusa, they were in charge of binding the Daled Minim of the Reish Galusa. Ki Gadlisu, Hoshana, the Bereish Galusa, Shairi Bebeis Yad. Make sure to leave below the binding enough of a space in the lulav so that you could grab onto the lulav below the binding. Like, for example, we have these kaishalach. So make sure that the kaishalach are not all the way towards the bottom in such a way that the only way you could grab onto the lulav is by holding onto the kaishalach. Leave some extra space below the bind in order to grab onto the lulav. Why? Because the Torah requires you have to take the daled minim. And if you're going to use something other than the daled minim for a binding agent, and then you're going to grab on to the daled minim, you're holding on. Like, let's say, for example, according to what the Gemara answers here, that they used a gold fiber to wrap around and connect the three minim. If you're holding on to that gold becomes a chatzitza, and it interposes between your hand and the daled minim, and that's not called lakicha. Rava Omar, I disagree. Cholino also eno chotzeitz. If he's adding that binding agent, in order to beautify the lulav, it becomes an integral part of the lulav. It's not something that's eno mino and therefore serves as a chotzeitz. It's not a chatzitza. Anything that's part of the daled minim is not a chatzitza. If you add something outside, external to the daled minim, and then you hold on to that and it separates between your hands and the daled minim, that could be a problem. But if it's part of the daled minim, and here Rav has a breakthrough, and he says that if you're beautifying the daled minim and you're fulfilling the mitzvah zeh kelim yaveyu, then it becomes an integral part of the daled minim, and therefore it's not a chatzitza. Another statement by Rabbah. We're going to have a whole series of statements of Rabbah with comments of Rabbah. Amar Rabbah lo linkod inish hoshana bisudra. The Torah says ulakachtem lachem. Don't wrap your hands with a sudar. A sudar is a turban. It's made out of cloth. And if it's made out of cloth, then it's a chatzitza between your hand and the daled minim. This is the issue of gloves. Rabbi, also, if you see anyone who takes the daled minim wearing gloves, then tell him he's got to get into the machlokas here between Rabbah and Rav. Because Rabbah would say, for one thing, it's a chatzitza, and he's not yotze, there's no lakicha. Debe'ina lakicha tama veleka. We need a complete lakicha, and a complete lakicha means that there's no interposition, there's nothing that separates his yad from the daled minim. And if he's wearing something around his hand, then that's going to be a chatzitza, and it undermines and invalidates his lakicha. For Rav Amar, Rav disagrees again. Lakicha al yedei davar acher shma lakicha. Rav is maintaining the shita that the scarf, or we'll call it in our language a glove that he wears around his hand, is not something that's extraneous to the daled minim. It's similar to the previous case of Rava, where he beautifies the daled minim, and therefore this is not something extraneous to the daled minim, to the lakicha, that would therefore serve as a chatzitza undermining lakicha, but rather it could be integrated completely into the lakicha tam. Why? Because if this is the way he set up his lakicha, then it's not a foreign element. So now we have two chidushim of Rava. Chiddush number one is that if he adds something to the lulav, meaning the binding of the lulav, and he does it to beautify the lulav, that's not a chatzitza. And now Rava takes it even one step further. If he adds something not to the daled minim, but to his hands, and he, in a sense, facilitates or embellishes his lakicha, that's also not considered a chatzitza. Now the Gemara says, wait a second. You're going a little bit too far off. I understand if you ornament and beautify the daled minim, that ornament could be considered part of the daled minim. But if you're putting something on your hands, who says that that could be considered a lakicha when you grab the lulav, although it's your force and your power that's grabbing onto the lulav, but nevertheless, there's something separating between your hands and the lulav. So, Amar Rava, I'm going to prove to you that lakicha al yedei davar acher shma lakicha. That if you need something to help you and facilitate your lakicha, and it's another object, it's not a chatzitza. It's part of, integrated into the lakicha. And I'm going to prove it from a Mishnah that we're all familiar with in the 25th parak of Para, because we all learned the 25th parak of Para, didn't we? And what it goes on in the preparation of the mechatos for a Para. Azov katsar. Now the Torah requires that you take eitz azov. Azov is called in fancy English a hyssop. It's a kind of a low branch, and it has to be mixed with mayim. In fact, the azov is makadesh the mayim. It actually generates the sanctity of the mayim in order to produce the mei chatos that will facilitate tahara for a tummy mess. Mesapko bechut uvekush. And what that means is that if he needs to extend the length of this very, very short hyssop in order to put it into the kli where he's going to mix the water, because that's going to be the mixture that creates, is then you can use a chut, a thread, so the thread will help you lower the azov, the hyssop, down into this utensil, or a kush. Kush, we know from Masechet Shabbos when we talk about Meleches Oreg, and there the Mishnah talks about a kush. In English, it's called a spindle. You know, it's a long stick, like a tube, and you use it now to push the azov down into the kli where the water is. Vitovel umala. And now, by holding on to the spindle and attaching the hyssop to the end of the spindle or the end of this cord and lowering it down into the mayim, he can be makadesh the mayim. And the question is, how is that possible? Amai v'lakach v'toval omar Achmon. The Torah says that he should take the azov and dip it into the mayim, v'toval b'mayim, which means a kind of a maisa lakicha. Even though he is lowering the azov into the mayim by using some sort of an extension, in this case, a spindle, that's considered a lakicha, that's considered a maisa tvila. Gemara says that's not a proof at all. Nimai dilma shiny hasam, that's different. Why? Kevan de chabre kegufe dami. He takes the azov and he ties it down to the end of the spindle. And therefore, when he's holding the spindle and there's an azov tied down to the spindle, that makes it into a lakicha. It's as if he is taking the Azov and dipping it into the Mayim to be Makadish the Mayim. But not so in our case of Hoshana, where he wraps a cloth, around his hands. The cloth is not attached to his hands, and therefore it's not Chabe Uke Gufay Dami, and therefore it's a foreign extraneous object that separates his Yodayim from the Hoshana which he takes for the mitzvah L'kachtem L'chem. Ella says the Gemara Me'hacha. Let's look at another Mishnah in Masechet Parah. Now we're going backwards. We're rewinding from chapter 25 in Masechet Parah back to chapter 6 in Masechet Parah. And there we're going to learn a Mishnah about something called a shfoferes and a shokes. The shokes is the kli that holds on to the mayim. And the shfoferes is a tube. And what he's going to do is he's going to take the afer, the ashes of the paraduma, and he's going to put it through this tube. And we're going to see in a moment that the Mishnah says that this is possible. But when we want to be Makadish the Mayim, then what the Mishnah establishes is that nafal, please underline the word nafal, is possible. And why is that so? The Torah tells us in Parshas Chukas that they are required to be nosein. Nosein means to place. Let me just see if I have the pasuk here. I'd read the pasuk to you. Let me just get a chumash here, maybe. Here it is at the beginning of Parshas Chukas in Bamidbar Yutes. It says that he's got to burn the paraduma. That's in pasuk Hey. V'lakach hakohen eitz ezov eretz v'ezov shnisas v'shlich el tok sreifas hapara. So the Mishnah is telling us that when the Torah says that the Kohen has to be involved actively in preparing this concoction, which we call mechatos, the Torah requires intention, kavanah. However, nefila is possible. Let me fast forward towards the end of the parsha. It says, "V'nasan olav mayim chayim," and the Mishnah in Parah assumes that "v'nasan olav mayim chayim" means a nesina with kavanah, as opposed to nefila, where the mayim fell on its own.